And we're really, really honoured to be joined this afternoon by Peter MacFadyen. He's going to be talking to us about reclaiming politics. Peter has worked in social justice for 40 years, working with everything from disability rights to trying to lessen the impact of climate change for people in Africa. Back home, he founded the Sustainable Frome and is the director of Frome's new renewable energy co-op. Oh, can't say it. He has spent 8 years as a town councillor, and from this experience, he wrote Flat Pack Democracy, which sets out how to take power back at a local level of government, and then Flat Pack 2.0, which shares the experiences of both Frome and other towns run by the people and for the people. And that chimes with a lot of the themes that have been running through the talks the last couple of days about how we have more agency as individuals and how we take back some power at a local level and the power of community. So welcome, Peter. Hello.
So essentially, I'm going to tell a horror story, a sort of after lunch horror story, which hopefully will keep people awake. And then you can choose the ending, so you can decide whether it's going to be a horror story or not when we get to the end. I just wanted to say, because of course, one of the things, I've no idea how many people are out there at this moment, or how many people I'm talking to. One is in this very surreal, or I'm in this very surreal situation of talking to a little dot on a computer without knowing who's there and who isn't, or where you are. So I'm talking to you from an attic in Frome, which is a market town in southwest England, and with a population of about 30,000 people. Which is where I've lived for the last 30 years. And what I want to do is to, as I say, to tell a horror story, essentially to introduce or to give you my take on how democracy has developed and hasn't developed over the last 3,000 or 4,000 years, and then how we might look to actually create a democracy, because my take, as you will rapidly hear, is that we haven't actually had one for many years. So that's what I intend to do, and I'll do it now. So I suppose the first thing to say is that we don't really know how people divided up power initially, the first peoples on the planet. But it's fairly sure, I think, that women had much more key positions than they do now, that within groups of people as they moved around, women would have had incredibly important roles. And although they might not have been at the front of gatherings, they were often there in possibly around the outside of the fire, making many of the decisions that really mattered. And there would have been a lot of complex systems of inclusion and recognition, lots of forms of consensus and consent. Those two being slightly different: consensus where you all have to agree, and consent where enough of you agree to make it happen. So for thousands of years, those things happened and functioned for humankind, I guess. And then the first thing we really know about in terms of it being recorded, and well recorded, was the Greek systems of democracy. So demos is the people, kratos, rule, how the people ruled. And the Greeks really did set out a system in which the people would rule. Now, there's a slight proviso, because they are now actually actively excluding women from that system, and slaves and some of the poorer people, but they set out a system which aimed to have a huge level of inclusion and the allowance of people to speak, of equality, of membership. It recognized the right to life and minority rights very much at its heart. And they felt that you needed to do this, otherwise the rich would inevitably dominate the system. And a lot of what they did involved sortition. Sortition is a random selection. So they would have these huge meetings of people, but they would also have key positions within their society selected randomly. And within your life, you could expect to serve as an adult male 3 or 4 times within the system, at least, and often, as I say, at quite high positions. The only equivalent we have to that, slightly ironically, I think, is that we still randomly select people to be on a jury. So until relatively recently, you could be randomly selected to decide whether somebody was innocent or guilty, and therefore lived or died. But that's the only bit of our system which allows that wider inclusion, that incredibly important decision we give back to the people, we've devised a different system, which I'll come on to for most other decisions. So you've got this Greek system, and they were quite clear, the Greeks, that if you had a representative electoral system, it would lead to oligarchy. In other words, if you had a system where you voted for people and they represented you, that would lead to them being corrupted, to them being bought, to that becoming some sort of hierarchical system, or a hierarchical system in which the rich retained their power. So they didn't want to do that. A few years later, the Greeks took over, read up their Greek history, and they thought, hey, we understand this. We need to devise a system which makes very sure that we don't do what the Greeks did. And so they devised a system which was indeed that hierarchical system, where you had representatives and a Senate and houses of representatives, where people were elected to represent you. They got corrupted, and the rich became, from the outside and the inside, the people who were really in power. And then you had a few, centuries, I suppose, of barbarians, and I don't know what political system they used, or what system of representation or otherwise, if any. Of course, there are systems of, there are indigenous people still doing their stuff all over the world with whatever they were doing in their own ways. As I say, many of which may well have been, and almost certainly are, way better than anything that either we or the Greeks were doing. But putting them to one side, which I shouldn't do in some ways, but putting them to one side in a way, what happened next is that as European systems started to move from royalty towards parliamentary systems, they took on the Roman model. So they took on, absolutely clearly, a system by which the effectively the rich and the powerful kept the power. And that's what we exported to our colonies, and everyone else did too, the French, the Spanish, and all the rest. Notably, of course, the American colony. And the Americans absolutely clearly set out to devise a system which was not about one man, one vote, and ensuring that voting, that power was spread. There are notes from when they drew up their constitution, which set out the deliberations with which they devised a system with their quite complex, their very complex system between their two houses and their president, which made bloody sure that the power stayed with the rich. So that's kind of where in a way we've got to, I guess. And I just wanted to share that with you. It's the background. I mean, people talk about Britain often, or we talk about the mother of all parliaments. We talk about living in a democracy. I'm absolutely clear that we do not live in a democracy, and never have done. In the sense that we have never had a situation in which people have truly been able to take part and ensure that the majority got their view. And of course, in Britain, we've made that even more of a farce by our first past the post electoral system. So that now we've devised things so that it's winner take all. So that this means that an even smaller group of people can ensure that they stay in power forever. And the system ensures that that's what happens. And so you don't have the plurality, you don't have the representation which other systems within Europe have. They're far from perfect, but forms of proportional representation, which would mean that at least the people who are a minority view would have some form of representation. That simply doesn't happen for us. So I regard our system as a complete and utter farce in virtually every way. This is, I guess, primarily I'm talking about our national system, but that seeps down to, in our case, county, district, or unitary or municipal, the lower levels of local government as well. And where you really see that, or one of the ways you really see that, I think, for us now is, in this period of pandemic, is just check out where the handouts are going, or where the support is really going now to businesses and so on. So you look and you see 600 million going to EasyJet, and other things like that which are happening. So EasyJet, just to use that as one example, a private company with private shareholders, getting this vast amount of public money, which may only be for a loan. I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes a grant. And other similar things are happening all over the place, which just say something about where the links between power and people are. And to stick with that example, the vast majority of people in Britain have said they don't want to go back to where we were before the pandemic. And there's a huge concern around climate change. But where's the power? The power is with the oil industry, with the airline industry, and so on. And those are the people who are meeting with politicians, and those are the people who will be getting the companies and the people who will be getting the biggest handouts. So here we are, ruled by political parties, but who are made up of politicians, but they don't actually answer to the people who vote for them, and they certainly don't answer to the people who don't vote for them. So that's actually a complete disaster, and for all of us. And actually, it's increasingly a disaster for the elite who ostensibly benefit, because it's a total disaster for life on Earth. Because these people are set on a path which is designed to further their personal wealth through a growth and consumption model and an ownership by the few. But I think we increasingly know, and anyone who's been listening to any of the talks of the last day and yesterday will know well that that path of growth and consumption is an unmitigated disaster for the planet. So it's a model which actually benefits no one. And you may be thinking, you may have left, of course, because I don't know who's out there, and there may be nobody out there anyway. But and of course you're free to do that at any time. You may be thinking, I thought he was talking about reclaiming politics, but actually he's just given us a little prattle of basic thoughts on where democracies come from. And I have, but I want to come to reclaiming politics, because one of the worst things for me about this system which we've devised is that it's actually disempowered so many of us from taking part. And if I go back to where I started, if you were in Athens, population of about 40,000, not actually that much smaller than Froomes, which is about 30,000. When they met to make a decision, there were never less than 6,000 people in an assembly. So, okay, admittedly, they're 6,000 of the men, and they're not the slaves. But what they were doing was they were taking a huge chunk of the population to constantly make decisions. And yes, that took time, but that's what they did. And that's how they devised, came up with decisions which were beneficial to the vast majority of people rather than the few. So they met to make decisions with this, very significant number of people constantly. And compare that to what we've got, where decisions are actually made by the cabinet, not by Parliament, and not by, or is Parliament part of? No, wait a minute. Parliament is part of, Parliament, government, Downing Street, all of these things muddle together, don't they? But there's a tiny number of people who might be a cabinet of 50 people or whatever it is, the vast majority of whom are very rich individuals, mostly men, and mostly from top public schools. So this tiny group are making those decisions for us. And then you've got unelected people like Dominic Cummings in the background pulling the strings. And that leaves us to mostly disengage. So most people kind of just disengage with all of that, have nothing to do with it, and don't understand or particularly care about it. There's a small group who will rage and moan about it, and most of us just sort of gently moan. But the case that I want to make, or what I suppose I've felt for a long time, is that at a personal, family and local level, actually most of us are engaged in politics. Because politics is actually about discussing, arguing, understanding, changing our minds, requesting, lobbying, changing things. For me, that's what politics is about. Politics is about what I'm doing with you now. It's actually trying to better think through how things could be better or improved. It's about little decisions about our communities. It's not the party political system, which I've described for you and have set out to be so completely and utterly unfit for purpose. And linked to that is the fact that there's only 2% of the adult UK population is a member of a political party. So there's 98% of us who are actually outside of that process completely. So we've given away our power to this tiny, if you like, in this case, the 2%. And that 2% is, you know, even of them, most of them probably aren't really involved or much involved. Some of those will be involved in helping to set out the manifestos, to decide what parties do and so on. But they're effectively deciding what the menu is. So we get to choose from 3 or 4 different menus, which have been created by this very, very tiny number of people. But the case I want to make to you is that actually most of us are really involved in making decisions, but just not with that process. And what we do is that we look at the papers, we look at the news, we engage, you know, or if we do, we sort of see all that and we think that that is politics. We think that that is where decisions are made. We think that, you know, that's what matters. Because if you turn on the radio, you turn on the TV, you turn on, you know, you read the newspapers, we're constantly being told that that's what matters. I don't think it is what matters. And it's actually something which we can't, as individuals, easily do much about in many ways. And that's what I want to talk a little bit more about. Because I want to take this bit of conversation in the next 10 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes, to something I think we can do. But I want to just offer you sort of 4 options as I see it. Because, you know, obviously there are options. There is this system, which I've set out for you, you know, as being completely hopeless. And you can take part in it. You know, you can vote at a national level. You know, every, whatever it is, 5 years, we get this opportunity. But I would say that in the vast majority of places in Britain, it's not worth demeaning yourself by taking part in that farce. I've come to that view after, whatever, 30, 40 years of voting. I didn't vote in the last 2 elections because it was a complete and utter waste of my time. And you know, I just felt that I simply felt that I'd come to a point where I didn't want to be associated with something which was such a complete and utter sham. So there are a few exceptions. There are very few places in Britain where there will be, you know, swing seats and marginals where it may be worth making a difference because it may lead to something different at the Houses of Parliament. But don't fool yourself into thinking that that's going to make a lot of difference. And we need to recognise that none of the major parties are interested in changing the political system, because once they're in power and they don't want to change it. So, you know, how can you reclaim politics? You can vote at a national level, and every 5 years you get that chance. I would say that's a total waste of time. My option 2 is violence. This is a book called, I'm going to look at it, Drinking Molotov Cocktails with Gandhi, which sets out the case that all the major changes that have happened in the world or political world, things like the political change in South Africa, the political change in India, came about with an element of a strong element of violence in there. And that actually, you know, that needs to be in there to force the system to change. He doesn't make the case. He doesn't say that, you know, a total military coup is the only way of doing things, but he feels that violence is essential. Now, I read that and I understand where he's coming from, but I also read this, or I've read this, and this incidentally is one of my Desert Island books. This is Blueprint for Revolution, which is a whole set of ideas. It says how to use rice puddings, Lego men, and other non-violent techniques to galvanize communities and overthrow dictators, or simply change the world. It's a fantastic book. And the case that he makes is that violent revolution will almost always lead to a cycle of violence, which is very difficult to escape and is very destructive in its processes. And it tends again to to polarize power with a few men, which is where I don't want to get to. So my feeling, you know, I've only taken, I mean, I'm only mentioning these two books, but my feeling is that violence is actually completely unhelpful. And I have another thing to say about that I don't think it's an option within our police state, because we're now so sufficiently monitored and so on, that it would be incredibly difficult. Actually, I think totally impossible to run a violent revolution. And even if you did, I think it would not lead to what you wanted in the long term. Certainly not what I would want. But it leads, and certainly Blueprint for Revolution leads to a third option, which is protest. And protest in the last few years has had a real up, I think, a real boost. Extinction Rebellion has shown that, you know, that mass protest can lead to change. And now we're in the middle of I don't know, we're at the beginning, I hope, of mass protest around Black Lives Matter. And what those are showing is that, you know, significant protest, often with some edginess, you know, things like chucking statues in the river, or a degree of, well, a high degree of people getting arrested. In the Extinction Rebellion's case, thousands of people, of ordinary people, if you like, getting arrested. That can lead to real change. But, and for me, there's a huge but in this, which is beware the review, the Royal Commission. You know, those, it's like, where does this go? The system actually quite likes a degree of protest. It doesn't like it when it gets too edgy and too many statues are destroyed. But letting people let off steam and then fobbing them off with something which, like, you know, as I say, like a commission or a review, is where these things often end up. And that's not what's needed. If we're going to get, in the time that we have, to really significant change, then I don't think that protest alone will do that. I think it's an enormously useful and incredibly important tool, and we should do far more of it. But we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that the system is going to crumble because of a few changes. And also, we need to broaden those protests out so that Extinction Rebellion needs to recognize that system change around, you know, a relationship with things like Black Lives Matter is incredibly important, so that it becomes this flowing together of protests to lead to fundamental and widespread system change. If we just pick on one thing, like Black Lives Matter, that in itself might change the lives of black and colored people, but that's not big enough. So those three things, voting at a national level, violence and protest, the first two I think are a waste of time or won't get anywhere. Protest is a useful tool. And the final bit I want to come to is taking power at a local level. Because what I've been involved in for the last 10, 11 years in Frome is an experiment in which we initially took power as a group of individuals who'd never been involved in local politics before, and set about to change things radically. So we set about to remove the old and make it fit for the 21st century. And that's a process that we started, and it's not finished. I'm no longer a councillor. I didn't stand last year. And there's a new group of people who've taken on that mantle. And I hope we'll continue to radically change and alter things, because there are 10,000 of these local councils in Britain, and most of them don't do very much. They're very, very unambitious. And there's a huge opportunity to change them. And, you know, in a way, what they were doing before and what many of them are doing now didn't matter. But when austerity came along and suddenly there's no money at higher levels, and these local levels of local government have to help, you know, have to really make things happen, or they won't happen, that was incredibly important. We're now faced with recovery, if that's going to be the right word, from Corona. It'll be at a local level that this is done or not done, and then rapidly followed or intermingled with Brexit, intermingled or rapidly followed with climate change. So the case, I think, we have to get a local level joined up system in which local government, i.e. councils, local councils can play a key role. But that role is different from the traditional one. It's different from the Roman one. It cannot be about people just representing people. It cannot be about every 4 years I vote for my local councillor and they toddle off and do things on my behalf. It has to be about what we have tried to set in place in Frome, where you have way more participation, way more involvement by people, and significantly, the council becomes a facilitator of activity, action, and engagement by local people. So you have organisations within the town that work for poverty, work on on housing issues, work as they have done now around supporting people caught up in the pandemic. And the council's role is to support those, to facilitate them, sometimes to catalyse them, but essentially it's not to do it. It's to be there to underneath the population, and that means something which is not. It's not about representation. It's about participation, and that's what we tried to set up in Frome. And as it was said in the introduction, I described that process of how we took power in flat pack democracy, which was aimed at being a DIY guide on how to how to make this happen. And then a second book, which was was that worth doing, which draws on the experience of others in other councils who'd copied the model, if you like. And so over the last 3 months, I think what we've got in Britain is a really interesting situation where lots of people have been involved in things like mutual aid societies and mutual aid groups, have come together in ways that they haven't before. And they've actually started doing politics in a way that they never had before. People who had never thought of themselves as being community organisers, community leaders. And that might be just on a street. It might just be about checking out who needs support. And I'm really, really interested in who those people are and whether they might be, focal, people who can step into the void, if you like, at local government level, who can be part of taking over their councils, of making those councils work. And why am I banging on about councils? Because they have access to money and access to staff resources and potential to really make things happen, so that a good council can make the difference between a community that kind of works well and functions and one that really works well and functions. And we're going to need that. And I've said this a number of times, but I think we're really moving to a situation where we're dependent on that. Because, as I've tried to make clear, or in my view, don't expect anything from central government. Central government doesn't care. Central government is essentially engaged in trying to get re-elected and in keeping their snouts in the trough. So that if we don't reclaim politics in this way and take over, and I don't just mean councils, I mean workers' co-ops, I mean land trusts, I mean all of these other plethora of ways which people can reclaim the whole way that we run our lives. This, incidentally, is very much the core of a new project of Extinction Rebellion called Trust the People. If you Google Trust the People under Extinction Rebellion or Extinction Rebellion's Future Democracy Hub, you'll find what they're doing. And that's about trying to bring together a confluence of organizations that are doing this. And my long-term plan, my plan for taking over the world, is that if this happens enough, if we're able to rebuild these organizations and re-engage at a local level, build off the back of the pandemic, take over councils in at least 10,000, well, there only are 10,000, across the country, then that scaling up will put so much pressure, so much engagement on those levels above that they become effectively redundant. And they also need to pay attention to this vast upswelling of re-engagement. And I want to just finally say that I and others will be supporting people who want to move towards taking over their councils in 2021. There'll be more elections then because the 2021s were cancelled. So if you're interested in that, if you think you might want to do that, or who others who are, then contact me through Googling Flatpack Democracy, and we can see where that goes. That's basically what I wanted to say to you. I realize I've of course I've gone on more than usual, but we've got about 20 minutes, hopefully, to talk about, you know, anything you want to that relates to that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, interesting set of of four things. Yeah, not voting. I don't know. I'll just go through some of those. And I've got a couple of questions that people have put, and please do put other questions in. We'll get to those in a moment. But yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. Your first one, which was about not voting at the election. I mean, Russell Brand famously talked about that a couple of elections ago, and I don't know, I am a voter, and I can't say I've been that through all of my life, but I've become more of a voter. I mean, you know, the seat that we're in is now in Frome is now a strong Tory seat, but a few years ago, before I came here, it was a Liberal seat and so on, and these things do make a difference. And you know, the system is well weighted against, and if we you know, I mean, a large proportion of the population don't vote already.
Yep.
And, you know, they just get completely ignored and so on. So I'm not comfortable about the not voting thing. But moving on.
I hear you.
You know, it's yeah, you know, it's like, anyway. So be that as it may, we could spend an unhappy half hour on that on that one. And your second one was about violence, and it's a question that I struggled with throughout my life, having come from my parents' generation who were in the Second World War, and responses that they had to that, and to very strong perception of nuclear weapons in the 20th century, and really embracing kind of non-violence as a solution. But I heard a quote from Malcolm X quite recently, which says that non-violence depends upon a level of empathy in the person, in the people that, you know, the organization, whatever that you're opposing. And that really struck a chord for me. It's like, yeah, okay, so you have Waffen SS bashing down your door, and you can be as non-violent you like, but you're out of here. You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, you know, it really seems that there isn't a simple thing. And you know, you also went on to say that, yeah, the problem with violence is, you know, and all violent revolutions eat themselves. In the end, you know, if the means, you know, the end doesn't justify the means, and lots of people have used that as a justification for all sorts of terrible.
And as you know, Mike, I mean, a lot of my work experience was in Africa, and so often the coups that they have had there in various countries, which at the time you think, oh great, we've got rid of, you know, the despotic Mugabe or whoever it might be, but to be honest, you know, the new one, whoever they might be, is not a lot better, and it doesn't take long for their rhetoric to disappear. And I mean, there's been some such sad examples of where people who came in saying all the right things, and a few later are just as bad as the person that they took over from.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems that people have, and you know, people are very often easy to say, oh, you know, politicians, but I think what happens is that when you campaign for election and so on, you have these ideas and ideals and so on. But when you think just about your people and your voters and so on, but when you get into the seat of power, something happens to your brain, because somehow you have to include all of these other things as well. And that's why we complain about politicians who, you know, who then have to compromise and realize that actually situations in life are more nuanced than they imagined when they were just in their own party thing. But now they're in power, there's all these other things. And it's not so simple. It's not so black and white. They realize there's all these complications, and it's you know, it's not so easy. So, you know, I think that's, I often we've seen, you know, we get the politicians that we deserve because they are actually a reflection of us in one way or the other. Whether it's a reflection from not voting, that's also partly a reflection of us from our consciousness and so on.
I think it's really important that for me, that you know, I try and always take us back to the system. It's a system that I think is wrong rather than the individuals. And I would say that's the same, you know, Annabelle and I were watching something last night around, which is a Black Lives Matter film. You know, and it's easy to divert attention, even onto the policeman who murdered, you know, that guy. You know, it's like, it's not. I'm absolutely not saying there's anything right about what he did, and absolutely that needs to be punished in every way. But it's not. He is part of a system, and the same is true of the political system. It's like it's not you know, our MP's fault. I don't think. He is basically a sound and good man, but he operates in a system which is totally and utterly dysfunctional.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's the question, isn't it? How to change that? And so then your third point was about protest, and I think that XR has shown that there's a long history of creative protests and so on, bringing fun into protests. The merry pranksters go back to the 60s, and the what were those other guys who took over various things, and you know, so there's, and I think these things can be very powerful to really insert into the dialogue, and I think your point about really that it's not one thing or another, because climate change is also a Black Lives Matter thing. Social justice. We can't sort out climate change and then we'll go and sort out social justice. It has to be. I mean, for me, that's always been one of the great things about the transition movement, that it really sees the link between all of these things. It's not one thing or the other.
Yeah. Mike, tell me, I've got some question and answers at the bottom. Will I be able to see them? Are they on Facebook? Will I be able to access and answer those after we've talked, you know?
Well, we'll make that possible. One of the questions, we've got a question here from Karen in the chat, and she says about your thing about taking power at the local level, which we're moving on to, is do you have to be on the council to affect the change? And what do you need to do? What do you need to do that, if so?
So, to affect, so do you need to be on the council to affect change? No, I mean, there are changes that can be made within a community, obviously, and things like my mentioning of the mutual aid organisations. It was organisations outside of councils that have often led the response to the pandemic. So you don't have to be part of a council. My point was, or what I was trying to say, is that a well-functioning council can make it so much easier for people within a community. They can you know, oil the wheels. They can get planning permission for the buildings that are needed. They can, you know, help to get money from different sources. They can provide staff to do the training, so on. So all of those things can be done much more easily. You don't need to be on the council, but if you've got a council which is saying yes, it's much easier than a council which is saying no. And at the lowest level, councils mostly say no, because actually there are layers above them who have most of the power. So my experience is that, you know, that the answer normally when you go to your council is, oh no, that's nothing to do with us, mate. And that's most people's experience. So but actually that can be turned around. You can, you know, councils, even at this town parish level, can be saying yes. And there are huge numbers of things which can be done, which incidentally, I mean, Flat Pack 2 sets out the vast majority of that is, in one sense, slightly nerdy. It's stories of what have been achieved in towns who have done what they wanted to. The town council only has to run allotments. What do they have to do? Have one meeting a year and run allotments. That's
burials as well.
No, that's the next level up. Burials are district.
Parish one.
No. So you know, that's all they have to do. So everything else they can do, but they don't have to. But most councils in Britain don't. They still sit there. They, you know, the mayor puts their chain on. They do as little as possible and then go and have a pint. And my argument is that that's got to change. Or, you know, if you're happy in a community which is going to, you know, wander into Brexit and climate change and post-COVID, completely unable to support itself, carry on.
So, okay, well, you mentioned Brexit, and you know that is on the horizon, and it's been interesting here with COVID as well that you mentioned. You know, here in Frome, we've had, you know, I think, you know, hundreds of people have been volunteering to help people who are isolating and so on. How do you think, you know, because with Brexit, you know, it's the regulations of what can be imported and so on. Are we, you know, we're a twin town with some places in France. Are we going to kind of invoke twin town connections? Is that a link strong enough? How will, at a local level, will we cope with the lack of imports?
We need to it goes back to resilience and strengthening and building those links internally, doesn't it? And one of the things, again, we've seen over the last 3 months in Frome is it's a massive upturn in people growing stuff. And you know, again, a functioning town council is now orchestrating a quick review or some research onto you know, what is being grown, what is coming locally, you know, who is producing what. So that bit of research is being done so that we can hopefully build to strengthen those. And then there's lots of models of you'll know, Mike, better than me. Are they community-owned farms, community something agriculture, isn't it?
Yeah.
Something, you know, so basically farms or land that is either co-owned or where there's a farmer who then local people buy shares, or for instance they pay up front for a whole load for regular vegetables and so on.
There are a number of models of community supported agriculture.
That's it, CSU, thanks, or CSA, that's it, community supported agriculture. So there are loads of things like that we can do, and I think we're going to have to, because Britain currently imports so much of our food, you know, and I don't know, if we're about to blunder, as we probably are, into a zero agreement, you know, wander off the edge of the cliff on January the 1st or whenever it is, we're going to need to learn to eat turnips.
I bring back some very unhappy memories of of a childhood being faced with turnips. But yeah, so you don't have to be on the council. There are things that you can do. I mean, I think one of the things that people have talked about in their communities with COVID is the connections between people in their actual local neighbourhoods. That certainly in Frome that has been very much encouraged, but I think that's a report that one can see coming from around the land, how neighbours have really started talking to each other, buying, shopping for people who are vulnerable and isolating and so on. So you know, so the things like that one can do, and that I think is the question: is where do you start? What are the things that you can do? You know, without necessarily even involving the council.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of that is just getting involved, isn't it, in what community activity exists, however bigger or smaller community you know, people live in. And again, I mean, I know I keep saying it, but there have been so many brilliant examples all over the country of people meeting their neighbours for the first time in the last few months. And I also, you know, want to recognise that the pandemic has been, you know, a completely horrible experience for many people in their homes, and also obviously in terms of lost jobs and lives and so on. But there are also opportunities that have come out of this, which I have to say, from you know, again, central government is squandering by the day, because although they said, you know, we won't put things back like they were, we will support a green economy as we re-emerge. That's not what's happening. Just look at where the money is going now in terms of you know, re-supporting businesses, and it's totally shocking.
Carrying on with HS2 and
exactly, HS2 was carried on all the way through, wasn't it, with no social distancing. You know, the security officers dragging people out of the trees didn't do much social distancing. That's carried on under the cover of the pandemic.
So you know, taking a scale, and I don't know, we could even have a poll and so on. People could. Are you optimistic or not of you know, the way that people are going to pull together over the next year?
Am I optimistic or not? Depends on what minute you're asking me, Mike.
Your finger in the air, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, God, I mean, I lurch from deep despondency to optimism. I mean, my optimism comes from stories of ordinary people. I keep saying ordinary. That's not really what I mean, because they're anything but ordinary. But, you know, individuals amongst us who haven't got important jobs and roles and so on, doing fantastic things within their community. And again, Rob Hopkins of the Transition Movement, his latest book, It's just a glorious succession of brilliant ideas and initiatives that people have taken in their community. So those are the things that give me eternal optimism. You know, and the Campfire movement's been, well, Campfire movement itself, thank you very much, from what is to what if. Good. So, you know, the Campfire movement is in itself that, you know, something which has sprung up and is offering those that opportunity for exchange and ideas to be shared, which is brilliant. So that's what gives me optimism. And then I spot something about what's happening in Siberia, or, you know, which is like where the climate's gone completely to pot, or, you know, and I'm anything but optimistic.
Someone's asked about cryptocurrencies. Is that something that will play a part, really, or?
They're not really my specialist subject, to be honest. I don't know much about cryptocurrencies. I'm sure used well, they could be fantastic. And you know, it's not the same thing, but in Froome we've had over the years, I mean, you'll know through you know, the Alette scheme, which was massively functional. So I suppose what I'm saying is having systems of exchange and bartering and so on outside of the financial system, incredibly important. But I'm more interested personally in the local ones, like Alette schemes and other schemes of bartering. I don't really understand, I don't understand the national and international ones.
Yeah. Anna has asked about big locals. Are you familiar with that project?
Nope. Are you? Tell me about it.
No, I'm not. Only from
okay.
Yeah. It's a national lottery funded project for 150 highly deprived areas. Have been given £1 million over 10 years to make their places better to live. Local decisions, but it takes people time how to make decisions. But it is in year 5 starting to make a real difference. I think that's
okay.
You know, that's
an
interesting point about the time it takes for people to get the idea that they can be involved. I think we've become so disempowered.
Now that's really helpful. I knew about that. I knew about those lottery funded projects, and I hadn't realised at all that. I mean, I'm reading her note now, or her question. Sort of all decisions are taken by local residents, called big locals. I had no idea about that. I wonder how that interacts with the councils in those towns, because you get some interesting things going on. Going back to transition, where that transition town movement was based in Totnes, and then, I mean, the people of Totnes may well correct me, but I feel certainly in the past there was quite a lot of antagonism between the council and the transition town movement, really, because you had this fantastically successful community movement that was doing all sorts of stuff and attracting attention within the town, and then you have the council, who had said, you know, hang on, we've been elected to represent the people. How come everyone's coming to see you and you're doing such exciting projects? So I'd be really interested to know how the big local representatives. I'll get in touch with Anna. Big local representatives, you know, relate to the council.
There's a question from Jonathan as well. He talked about during a panel yesterday about bringing ethical change and the need for change both at the local and the central level. And I'm just reading his thing. He says, It seems on the surface that some of our biggest challenges can only be addressed when coordinated at a higher level. For example, changing the economic incentives for large corporations or rolling back national laws that limit people's freedoms. How can local councils address these problems? Or do you see the whole scaling up process of the transformation of local councils as a kind of ground up revolution that will ultimately have the same effect?
I do. I mean, I do to that last bit. Because I've kind of given up on the rest. I mean, I've written to my MP and done all that stuff for however old I am, you know, 40 years, and it's made not a jot of difference. And talking to my local MP, it's patently obvious why, because, you know, he gets thousands of those emails and things every day, and says, I haven't got time to do anything with this. The system's stuffed. So for me, it's not going to happen. And we can hope for all sorts of incentives for, you know, new farming subsidies post Brexit, which give preference to green and gorgeous things. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if there's a smattering of them, but I'd be amazed if there's enough to really upset the farming lobby, you know, so the huge landowners, and you know, they are huge. I read the other day, it's something like I think it's 6 people own. No, I might not get this wrong, so what's the point? but it's kind of like there's very few people own nearly all of Dorset, for instance, and I'm sure that's true elsewhere. I'd be amazed if those people aren't pulling the strings. So they're not going to let all their subsidies go. So for me, the only hope, and it may be a very naive hope, is for a genuinely grassroots revolution of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people being involved at community level, much more than they are now.
Yeah, land ownership in this country is a really hidden story and a whole subject in its own right, and we don't even have the right to know who owns what land, and much of it is still owned by families descended from the Normans.
Yeah.
Dorset, I'm sure, very strongly so.
Yeah.
Being in the south, but I think you're right. I can't remember exactly the figure that you mentioned, but I think it is about 6 people own about 60% of the land in England. So the idea that there isn't enough space for housing is a misnomer. It's because we're all squished into tiny areas.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't think you answered my question about optimism or pessimism.
Oh no, I didn't, because as I say, I flip and I flop. At this particular moment, I'm feeling quite optimistic. I've enjoyed this. You know, it's been a pleasant experience, and I'm really hoping that, well, as I say, that I can get to those questions, the question and answer questions after, which I will get to and answer. And I don't know if the ones in the chat, I don't know if they're the same. Yeah, they are, aren't they? The same ones in the chat. Anyway, so I've enjoyed this, so I'm feeling quite optimistic. Ask me tomorrow and I might not be. If I go and read the papers, I definitely won't be.
Yeah, stay away from that. Well, thank you, Peter. I think we're about coming to the end now, and I hope that all the participants who are both here and on Facebook and our recording have equally found something to be optimistic in Peter, and I know that you're very solutions focused and a great inspiration. So thanks very much for coming.
Thank you, Mike.
Thoughts. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Peter.
Bye for now.